Picture a speeding steam train chugging through the vast empty plains of the American West. Suddenly, masked bandits on horseback appear, gallop and ride alongside the locomotive. They leap from their saddles onto the moving train. A hail of gunfire erupts, and with a perfectly placed stick of dynamite, they blow the safe and ride off with bags full of cash. This is the image of the Western train robbery we all know from the movies. It's a thrilling, high-octane spectacle that has defined a genre for generations. But what if I told you that most of it is fake? That the reality of these heists was far grittier, messier, and often less successful than Hollywood would have you believe? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the most enduring myths of the Old West. We'll separate the hard facts from the Hollywood fiction to find out just how fake those famous train robbery scenes really are. If you love uncovering the real stories of the American West, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Part 1. The Real Age of the Train Robber. First, let's get the timing right. Movies often make it seem like train robberies were a constant threat throughout the entire Wild West era. But that's not quite true. While these crimes did happen over several decades, they weren't a random, widespread plague. The peak period for train robberies was actually very specific, the 1890s. This was a time when the railroads were expanding at an incredible rate, pushing into remote territories where lawmen were few and far between. These trains were like moving treasure chests, carrying huge payrolls and valuable goods through the wilderness. This created a perfect storm of opportunity for outlaws. And these crimes weren't happening just anywhere. They were concentrated in a few key areas. States like California, Missouri, Texas, and Oklahoma saw the highest numbers of heists. The rough terrain and booming economies in these regions made them hotspots for this kind of criminal enterprise. So instead of a nationwide problem, it was a regional one that burned brightly for a relatively short period. Even the story of the very first train robbery is often wrong. Many people think Jesse James pulled off the first one in 1873. But the history books tell a different story. The first peacetime train robbery in America actually happened years earlier. On October 6, 1866, a group known as the Reno Gang boarded a train in Indiana and made off with around $10,000. The era of the classic train robbery really came to an end by the 1930s, with a 1923 heist by the Doutremont brothers, often called the last great train robbery. This shows that this iconic crime had a clear beginning, a peak, and a definite end. The main reason outlaws targeted trains was simple: money. These locomotives were moving banks. The real prize was the express car. This car was basically a mobile vault guarded by a single man, the expressman. Companies like Wells Fargo and American Express used these cars to ship huge sums of cash, gold, silver, and other valuables. For bandits, hitting a train was a major step up from robbing a dusty old stagecoach. It was where the real money was. Part 2. The Robbers Playbook. Now, how did these robberies actually go down? Well, it was a lot less acrobatic and a lot more brutal than the movies show. The famous stunt of a cowboy jumping from his galloping horse onto a moving train is almost entirely a Hollywood invention. Think about it. Early trains could travel up to 30 miles per hour, about the top speed of a horse. Making that jump would have been incredibly dangerous and almost impossible. It looks great on screen, but it just wasn't practical. In reality, robbers had two main ways to stop a train. The first and most destructive was derailment. Outlaws would tamper with the tracks, sometimes by pulling a rail out of place with a rope right as the train approached. In 1873, Jesse James's gang did exactly this. But it wasn't a clean stop. The locomotive flipped into a ditch, killing the engineer and badly injuring another crewman. It was a crude, high-risk method that often led to tragedy. The second, more common tactic was to simply stop the train at gunpoint. The gang would either signal the engineer to stop, or they'd secretly board the train at a station and force the engineer to halt in a remote, pre-planned location. This was quicker, less destructive, and gave them more control. Once the train was stopped, the next challenge was getting into the express car and opening the safe. This is another area where Hollywood gets it wrong. In the movies, a stick of dynamite blows the safe door cleanly off, revealing perfectly stacked bundles of cash. The reality was much, much messier. These safes were tough, often called burglar-proof, and they were almost impossible to crack without the combination. Dynamite became the tool of choice, but it was a clumsy one. Too little, and you wouldn't even dent the safe. Too much, and you'd have a disaster on your hands. A large blast would often destroy everything inside the safe, along with the express car itself. Take the case of Elmer McCurdy in 1911. He used too much nitroglycerin and ended up melting the silver coins he was trying to steal into a worthless lump. His haul was only a few $100s. In another infamous case, the D'Autremont brothers' 1923 robbery attempt went horribly wrong when their dynamite charge proved far too powerful. The massive explosion not only destroyed the mail car, but also took the lives of 4 men. So, far from a clean getaway with stacks of cash, using dynamite was a gamble that often ended in failure and destruction. And what about the passengers? Movies love the scene where bandits walk through the passenger cars, robbing every one of their watches and jewels. While this did happen sometimes, it was usually a last resort. Most professional bandits, or distinguished bandits, as they were sometimes called, didn't bother with the passengers. They knew it was more trouble than it was worth. The real prize was in the express car, and wasting time with passengers just increased the risk of getting caught for very little reward. Part 3. The Real Outlaws. The men behind these robberies have become legends, but their real lives were a far cry from the romantic figures we see in films. Let's start with the most famous of all, Jesse James. He was often painted as a kind of American Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. This myth was largely a creation of one sympathetic newspaper editor who published James's letters and spun his story. There is very little evidence that Jesse James ever shared his loot with anyone. In reality, he and his gang were ruthless killers who murdered anyone who stood in their way. And his end wasn't a blaze of glory. At the age of just 34, he was shot in the back and killed by one of his own gang members, Robert Ford, who was looking to collect the reward money. Then there's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They were leaders of the Wild Bunch, a group known for being a bit more clever and less violent than other gangs. They pulled off several successful robberies, but the law, in the form of the relentless Pinkerton detective agency, was always on their tail. They eventually fled to Bolivia. While their final fate is debated, the most common story is that they were cornered by Bolivian soldiers and lost their lives in a shootout in 1908. The Dalton Gang is a perfect example of how badly things could go. In 1892, they tried to rob 2 banks at the same time in Coffeyville, Kansas. The townspeople fought back, and in a brutal 12-minute gun battle, 4 of the 5 gang members were killed, along with 4 citizens. It was a complete disaster. The fates of these famous outlaws show a clear pattern. They rarely, if ever, got to ride off into the sunset. They were usually killed, captured, or betrayed by their own men. Sam Bass was ambushed by Texas Rangers after a member of his own gang betrayed him. Black Jack Ketchum was the only person ever executed for the crime of felonious assault upon a railway train. His hanging was notoriously botched. The rope was too long, and he was decapitated. These violent, grim endings stand in stark contrast to the romanticized legends. The outlaw life was a brutal one, and it almost always ended badly. Part 4. The law fights back. As train robberies became more common, the railroads and the law started to fight back hard. At first, local sheriffs were often outmatched, but soon, the railroad companies, with their vast wealth, took matters into their own hands. They hired private detective agencies, most famously the Pinkertons. The Pinkerton Agency, with its motto, "We Never Sleep," became the stuff of legend. They were experts at infiltrating gangs and were pioneers in using techniques like collecting photographs to create what we'd now call a criminal database. But their methods were controversial. A botched raid on the James family farm led to the death of Jesse's young half-brother and earned the Pinkertons a reputation as a brutal private army for corporations. Many people feared them more than the outlaws they were hunting. Railroads also began building their own police forces. These special agents were tough men, hired to ride the rails and protect the cargo. They were, in essence, the railroad's private army. But the single biggest weapon against train robbers wasn't a gun. It was a new piece of technology, the telegraph. The telegraph was a game changer. As soon as a robbery happened, a message could be zapped down the line, alerting lawmen miles away. Posses could be formed and waiting for the robbers before they even knew what was happening. It made getting away much, much harder and tipped the scales heavily in favor of the law. This led to an arms race. Robbers started using dynamite, so the express companies responded with stronger burglar-proof safes. When gangs on horseback became a problem, the Union Pacific Railroad created its own elite pursuit team, a group of expert riders and shooters who traveled on their own secret train, complete with horses, ready to chase down any bandits at a moment's notice. Slowly but surely, these countermeasures made train robbery an increasingly difficult and dangerous way to make a living. The combination of tougher security, better law enforcement, and new technology squeezed the outlaws until the golden age of the train robbery finally came to an end. So the next time you see a Western and the bullets start to fly as cowboys leap onto a speeding train, you'll know the real story. The cinematic train robbery is a thrilling piece of American mythology, a symbol of the wild freedom and lawlessness of the frontier. But the reality was a story of desperate men using brutal methods to steal valuable cargo, and a story of how technology and determined lawmen ultimately brought that violent chapter of history to a close. The truth is often more complex and far more interesting than the legend. What's the most surprising thing you learned about real train robberies today? Or is there a famous movie scene you now see completely differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching.